close your eyes and let yourself drift into the gilded heart of the 17th century, into a France that blazed with a light no other nation could match, a kingdom that hummed with ambition, with ceremony, with the low, terrible weight of absolute power pressing down on everything it touched. There are kings, and then there is Louis XIV. He ruled France for 72 years, the longest reign of any monarch in the recorded history of a major European state. 72 years. Longer than most men lived. Longer than entire generations were born, grew old, and turned to dust beneath the dark soil of his kingdom. And through all of it, he never loosened his grip. Not once. Not for a single breath. His world was Versailles, a palace so vast, so deliberately, so overwhelmingly magnificent that it seemed less like a building and more like a declaration. Every gilded ceiling, every mirrored corridor stretching endlessly into the candlelight, every perfectly trimmed garden hedge extending all the way to the horizon, was a statement carved in marble and gold. This is what power looks like. This is what France is. This is what I am. He centralized authority as no king before him had ever dared. He gathered the old, restless nobility beneath his roof and quietly transformed them from independent warriors into dependent courtiers, elegant, perfumed, and entirely reliant on his approval. He constructed the mightiest standing army in Europe. He commissioned the greatest artists, composers, and architects of his age. He made French the language of every royal court across the continent. He made France itself the sun, and the entire world his orbit. And in the stillness of this night, we must pause and ask ourselves the question that has lingered across 3 full centuries of history. Does a man become the sun because he burns brightest by his own nature? Or does he become the sun because he simply refuses to allow anyone else to shine? Because he carefully arranges every soul around him into a fixed orbit and calls it divine, right? Perhaps there is no clear answer. Perhaps the Sun King himself never needed one. Settle in. Breathe slowly. And let us follow the extraordinary, deeply complicated, and profoundly human story of Louis XIV. From a frightened, shivering child king to the most powerful monarch the Western world had ever seen. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories, sleep dream are released here every day. He was 4 years old when the weight of France fell upon his shoulders. It is the year 1643. The corridors of the Louvre stretch long and cold in the gray light of a May morning, and somewhere within those stone walls a small boy sits beside the bed of a dying man. His father, Louis XIII, King of France, is fading, slowly, painfully, the breath leaving him in long, trembling sighs. The boy does not yet understand words like succession or regency or power. He only understands that the man in the bed is leaving, and that something enormous and invisible is pressing down upon him from above, settling into his small bones like winter cold. Louis XIII dies on the 14th of May, 1643. And just like that, France has a new king. He is not yet 5 years old. His mother, Anne of Austria, becomes regent. She is a queen who spent years enduring the cold suspicion of her late husband, marginalized, watched with distrust, kept carefully far from the levers of power. Now, suddenly, everything is hers, and she does not govern alone. At her side stands Cardinal Jules Mazarin, an Italian by birth, a diplomat by nature, a survivor by deep instinct, clever, calculating, and utterly devoted to the preservation of the French crown. He becomes the boy king's godfather, his closest tutor, the vast and careful shadow that falls across every room Louis enters. A man who wears robes of the church, but thinks always in the language of politics. The young king lives inside the Palais Royal, a building that carries the weight of ritual but offers very little warmth. His days are structured and carefully managed by hands that are not his own. There are tutors for Latin, tutors for history, tutors for the performance of kingship. There are courtiers who bow deeply and speak softly and watch him with careful, unreadable eyes. There are ministers who whisper to his mother in rooms he is not permitted to enter. He is addressed as Your Majesty with elaborate reverence, and yet he is powerless, the symbol of France without being its substance. He watches. He listens. He learns very early the particular texture of being present and invisible at the same time. It is a strange and quietly devastating education for a boy who will one day demand that every eye in Europe be fixed upon him alone. And then the storms begin. France, in the 1640s, is a kingdom under enormous and unrelenting pressure. Years of costly war against Spain, years of crippling taxation to fund those wars, years of Mazarin's deeply unpopular financial policies. All of it has built slowly and steadily to a breaking point. The nobility, the magistrates, the common people, all are restless, all are angry. And the anger, when it finally breaks fast and without mercy. The Fronde, a French word for a slingshot, a children's toy used for flinging stones. A dismissive name for what is, in truth, a civil war. Two civil wars, arriving in close succession, like blows from the same relentless fist. The first outbreak comes in 1648. Louis is 10 years old. The Parliament of Paris, the powerful legal body whose purpose is to register royal edicts, refuses to comply with Mazarin's financial demands. Several of their leaders are arrested in the night, and in response the streets of Paris erupt. Barricades rise before dawn, cobblestones torn from the roads and stacked into crooked walls, torches burning in the dark, the noise of the city transforming itself into a battlefield seeps through the thick walls of the Palais Royal, and the young king lies awake in the dark, listening. He can hear it, the shouting, the distant crash of stone, the low and frightening sound of a world that has decided, at least for this night, that it will not obey. The decision comes quickly, quietly, with very little ceremony. They must leave before morning. What follows is something that will never entirely leave Louis. In the deep, cold hours of early January 1649, the royal family is bundled from their beds and moved through the darkened streets of Paris in near silence. No fanfare, no royal procession, no waving crowds or gilded coaches announcing the passage of the king, just darkness and haste and the terrible, humiliating logic of flight. He is 10 years old. He is the king of France, and he is running. They travel to the royal chateau of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, set outside the walls of Paris, but the flight has been so sudden, so unplanned, that the residence has not been prepared for habitation. There are not enough beds, not enough firewood, Not enough furnishings. The rooms are deeply, persistently cold. The King of France sleeps on straw mattresses, wrapped in whatever coverings can be gathered in haste. The most powerful monarch in the Western world, shivering in the dark, listening to the silence of empty and abandoned corridors. He does not forget this. Not one single night of it. The Fronde drags on across years and phases. The Fronde of the Parliament, and then, more dangerous still, the Fronde of the Princes, when the highest aristocracy of France joins the rebellion. Men like the Prince de Conde, celebrated military commanders with armies of their own, whose names are as ancient as the kingdom, who were raised to kneel before the throne and who choose, instead, to threaten it. At certain moments, Conde marches his forces toward Paris itself. Louis must watch in silence as noble families negotiate openly with Spain and invite foreign soldiers onto French soil, soldiers of France's oldest enemy, welcomed into the kingdom by its own nobility. He learns in these years one of the most important lessons of his long life, that a smile at court is not evidence of friendship, that proximity to the throne is not the same as devotion to it, that the men who stand closest to a king are often the ones most willing to watch him fall. He does not forget. He does not forgive, but he waits between the fear and the flight and the long, cold nights. There is also education. Mazarin understands that the boy king must be prepared not merely to wear the crown, but to wield it with precision. Louis studies Latin, history, and geography, learning the shape of every border France touches and every border it might one day wish to expand. He learns to ride with genuine distinction, sitting tall in the saddle with the natural grace of someone who understands that even the way a king moves through the world carries a message. He learns to dance, because in this court, dance is not entertainment. It is display, it is dominance, the language of rank made visible in the movement of the human body. He learns to speak with deliberate care, selecting every word as if it might later be examined by those who wish to find a weapon within it. Mazar. Ein brings the boy into council meetings, not to speak, not to decide, only to observe, to sit at the long table and watch how ministers argue and defer and maneuver and deceive, how information is withheld as a form of power, how alliances form and dissolve inside a single afternoon. Louis asks his questions afterward, quietly, when the room is empty, and Mazarin answers with the careful attention of a man who knows. He is shaping something that will outlast him. The education is not warm. It is not joyful. Every lesson lands in a mind already marked by fear and cold and humiliation. Every lesson about the management of power is absorbed by a boy who once slept on straw while men with proud names burned his city. He is learning statesmanship the way the most important lessons are always learned not in the shelter of theory, but in the raw and unforgiving school of experience. Now sit quietly with a question that carries real and heavy. Wait, when a child is hunted inside his own kingdom, when the people he was born to rule force him from his bed and into the freezing dark, what does that do to the mind? It is simple enough to speak of forgiveness, but how many of us, if we are truly honest, could have been that boy and emerged capable of it? He was 10 years old, wrapped in a cloak in a cold corridor, fleeing the city that was supposed to love him. The men who built those barricades, the lords whose ambition drove them to gamble with the stability of France. Their sons would one day live inside his palace, under his eye at all hours, at his command. Louis will build Versailles. He will compel the very nobility that humiliated him to abandon their provincial estates and reside permanently within his walls, subject to his gaze, dependent on his favor for their social survival, stripped of every independence that might allow them to become dangerous again. Beautiful captives, yes, captives who dine from silver and wear the finest velvet in Europe, and dance in rooms lit by 10,000 candles. But captives, nonetheless. Was this vengeance? Was it wisdom? Was it simply the only conclusion a boy could reach who had once been cold and frightened and powerless in his own palace? Perhaps the golden cage of Versailles was never truly about punishment at all. Perhaps it was about something far older and far more human than that. Born in a cold room, on a January night in 1649, the bone-deep, unshakable need to make absolutely certain that no one ever again could make him run. The 9th of March, 1661. Cardinal Jules Mazarin drew his final breath before dawn. He was 58 years old, and his hands, which had guided France through 2 regencies, multiple wars, and the long turbulent childhood of its monarch, lay still at last beneath the silk of his bedsheets. In the adjoining chambers of the Château de Vincennes, a young king of 22 years rose, dressed himself in the gray morning light, and summoned his ministers. They came quickly, these careful men of long habit and great age. They arrived expecting a name, the name of the new chief minister, the new cardinal, the figure who would stand behind the throne and carry the daily weight of governance. France had always had such a man. Richelieu before Mazarin, Mazarin before the silence now settling over Vincennes. The system was familiar and ancient, and they expected it to continue. Louis looked at them steadily and told them, without ceremony, that there would be no chief minister. There would be no second man. When they had questions of state, they would bring those questions directly to him, and he alone would answer them. He would govern France entirely, without delegation, without a minister standing between himself and the machinery of the kingdom. He was 22 years old. He had been waiting for this moment for as long as he could remember. The silence in that room must have been remarkable. These were men trained to understand power as a building with many rooms, a responsibility shared among the capable and the cautious. They understood that kings were sacred symbols, figures elevated above the ordinary labor of administration. But Louis was telling them something they could not yet fully hear, that the symbol intended to become the engine itself. He would sit at his desk before his secretaries arrived each morning. He would read every significant dispatch. He would conduct every major audience. He would decide. Day after day, year after year, he would hold the entirety of France in his own hands and not set it down. This was not vanity alone. It was something forged in colder rooms, in the sound of a mob beneath his window, in the rattling of a carriage through night streets, in straw mattresses and bare floors, and the absence of furniture in the cold apartments of Saint-Germain. The boy who had been driven from his capital would not, as king, share his crown with any living person. He had simply been waiting for the right morning to say so. But declarations are only the beginning of a conquest, and Louis understood this with precision. There were men of enormous wealth and private ambition still moving freely through the landscape of France, and one of them had made the catastrophic error of believing that the transition of power was an opportunity for personal display. Nicolas Fouquet was superintendent of finances, extraordinarily rich, extraordinarily confident, and extraordinarily blind to the nature of the young king watching him. He had built himself a palace. The Château Vaux-le-Vicomte rose from the fields of the Isle de France in geometrical splendor, its painted ceilings and mirrored salons and perfectly engineered gardens surpassing anything in the royal domain. He employed the finest architect in France, the finest garden designer, the finest decorator. He patronized Molière and Lully and moved through his own magnificence like a man who had not understood that magnificence now belonged to one person alone. On the 17th of August, 1661, Fouquet threw a grand entertainment at Vaux-le-Vicomte and invited the king. Molière performed. Lully's music drifted over illuminated fountains. The fireworks were of such extraordinary quality that guests described them for decades afterward. Louis sat at the center of this brilliance, ate Fouquet's food, watched Fouquet's fireworks, smiled at the correct moments, and said nothing. 19 days later, Fouquet was arrested. The charges were embezzlement. They were not fabricated, but they were not the true reason. The true reason was simpler. Fouquet had permitted himself to outshine the crown in the crown's presence, and Louis found this unendurable. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in the fortress of Pignerol nearly 20 years later, never again seeing the open sky. His architect, his garden designer, his artists, all transferred into royal service, put to work on a project the king was only beginning to form. Louis had demonstrated, with one swift and terrible act of precision, what the new order required. You could be wealthy, you could be brilliant, you could be celebrated, but the only light permitted to dazzle in France was the light the king himself chose to cast. Into the vacancy left by Fouquet's destruction stepped Jean-Baptiste Colbert, a man made of entirely different materials. Where Fouquet had been flamboyant and reckless, Colbert was gray and meticulous. The son of a cloth merchant from Reims, he had risen through French administration by possessing one quality above all others: absolute usefulness. Mazarin had recognized it first. Louis now claimed it entirely. What Colbert found when he opened the royal accounts was disorder of a considerable magnitude. Years of war and mismanagement had depleted the treasury and corrupted the mechanisms of taxation and collection. He set to work with the thoroughness of a man who loved order, as others love music. He audited. He prosecuted war profiteers. He reformed tax collection, reduced unnecessary pensions, and promoted domestic manufacturing to keep French wealth circulating. Within French borders, the system later called mercantilism. He expanded the Royal Navy from a modest and aging fleet to a force capable of challenging England and the Dutch at sea. He founded the Académie Royale de Peinture et de Sculpture, supported the Académie des Sciences, and helped establish the Paris Observatory. Under his cold, exacting hand, the administrative skeleton of France began for the first time to assume a coherent modern shape. He was not loved. He was too precise, too willing to deliver unwelcome arithmetic to powerful men. But he was essential, and Louis knew it, and so Colbert worked. The treasury recovered. The great ambitions forming in the royal mind found ground beneath them. Yet even this was not sufficient. True absolute power required more than economic reform and one minister's ruin. It required the transformation of the social order of France itself. The ancient nobility had been the crown's adversary for generations. They owned the land. They commanded local loyalties. They had maintained private armies and administered their own territories with a sovereignty that made the king's authority, beyond Paris, largely ceremonial. And within Louis's living memory they had taken up arms against the throne, driven a child king from his capital, forced that child to sleep on straw floors in borrowed rooms. Louis had not forgotten. He had simply chosen the most elegant possible response. He did not strip the nobility of their titles. He did not confiscate their estates outright. He did not need to employ such blunt instruments. Instead, he built Versailles, and he invited them into it. Attendance at court became slowly and then completely the only available path to royal favor, to military appointments, to administrative positions, to the pensions and privileges that maintained great households in the style their dignity required. A nobleman absent from court was a nobleman forgotten. A nobleman forgotten received nothing. They came. They were given apartments within the palace. They attended the king's levee each morning and his coucher each night, competing for the distinction of handing him some small object during the ritual of dressing. They spent fortunes on clothes and carriages because to appear anything less than magnificent at Versailles was to announce weakness, and weakness there was a form of extinction. They borrowed against their estates. They became dependent on the very royal favor their grandfathers had once seized by force. And in their dependence and their gilded captivity, they became at last politically harmless. Louis watched all of it from the very center of the world he had designed with such care. He was patient. He was exact. He was content. And here, in the stillness of this late hour, before sleep comes, we must sit with a question that offers no easy resolution. Is absolute power a gift bestowed by God? Or is it a heavy, crushing stone a man must place upon his own chest to keep his empire from shattering? Louis believed it completely, that he ruled by divine right, that his authority was an extension of sacred and cosmic order, that God had placed him on this throne, and that his power was not ambition, but duty. To set it down would be to fail both his people and his Creator. But when we look past the ceremony and the anointing oil, we can still see something else beneath the surface. The boy sleeping on straw in an unfurnished room. The carriage moving through dark Paris streets. The sound of a city that did not want its king. Was it God who made Louis XIV absolute? Or was it the Fronde, still cold in his chest 30 years later? Was absolute power, in the end, the most magnificent fortress a wounded child ever built around himself? Perhaps the stone and the gift are the same thing. Perhaps the man who places the crushing weight upon his chest and bears it without collapsing becomes to those watching precisely what a king must appear to be. And alone in the quiet before the candles are lit and the court assembles, he is still only a man, bearing the weight, one dispatch, one audience, one careful, measured step at a time. There was a place once that began as almost nothing. a small, modest hunting lodge, set among the marshes and forests southwest of Paris, where a king might ride out for a morning, chase stag through the cool autumn air, and return before the light failed. Louis XIII had built it. It was a retreat, a private, uncomplicated thing. His son looked at it and saw something else entirely. By 1661, the lodge at Versailles was already living inside Louis's imagination. He had visited it as a boy, had perhaps pressed small fingers against its stone walls, and imagined. We cannot know the shape of that imagining, but we know what it became. We know what it cost, and we know precisely what it was designed to do. The transformation unfolded across decades through three great phases of construction, consuming the labor of tens of thousands. Architects, engineers, gardeners, sculptors, painters, masons, all drawn toward this single point on the French landscape, as if the earth itself had tilted toward it. Louis Leval began the first great expansion. André Lenotre was given command of the gardens. Charles Lebrun directed the interior decoration with a precision that bordered on sacred mania. Together, guided always by the king's exacting vision, these three men began to raise something the world had not yet seen. The numbers resist easy holding. At the height of construction, as many as 36,000 workers labored at the site on any given day. Soldiers were called in during the most demanding phases. Marshland was drained and remade. Hills were leveled. The very geography of the Isle de France was reshaped to serve a single vision. The Grand Canal, stretching nearly a mile and a half, was dug entirely by hand. Entire forests were transplanted. Mature trees moved root by root across impossible distances, because Louis would not wait for nature's patience. He wanted perfection now. The Hall of Mirrors was completed in 1684. 240 feet of gilded corridor, 73 arched mirrors facing 73 arched windows, overlooking Lenotre's geometrical gardens, 357 mirrors in total, arranged to capture the western light as the sun descended over the parterres. It was not coincidence that the Sun King built his greatest chamber to face the setting sun. Every detail at Versailles was theater, architecture made into political statement, stone made into argument, and Louis understood, with a cold, quiet certainty that never wavered, that a palace without its court is only an empty room. He had learned something during the Fronde. The nobility was dangerous when left to itself in the provinces. When they sat in their own chateaux, surrounded by their own retainers, collecting their own revenues, they were not his. They were independent. And independence, in Louis's understanding of the world, was another word for threat. So he made Versailles irresistible. And then he made it necessary. Beginning in the early 1670s, Louis drew the court steadily toward Versailles. He relocated there permanently in 1682, making the palace the official seat of French government. And he made clear, in the oblique way that was entirely his own, that a nobleman absent from Versailles was a nobleman outside the king's attention. Outside his attention meant outside his favor. Outside his favor meant outside appointments, rewards, favorable marriages, military commands. Absence from Versailles was a form of slow extinction. The great families came. The Conde, the Contis, the Rohans, the Montmorencys, Men whose ancestors had commanded armies and governed provinces for generations came to Versailles and were assigned apartments, sometimes quite small ones, but apartments at Versailles nonetheless. And they stayed. They stayed because the alternative was irrelevance. And irrelevance in 17th century France was its own species of ruin. Louis did not simply cage them. He adorned the cage. He made it so beautiful, so saturated with ceremony and splendor and the constant proximity of the royal person, that after a time it became genuinely difficult to imagine life anywhere else. The courtiers came to believe in it, or to perform belief so convincingly that the distinction ceased to matter. The instrument of this belief was etiquette. The court operated under a system of ritual so precisely codified, so exhausting in its demands on attention and memory, that navigating it successfully became a full and consuming occupation. The lever each morning, the ceremony of the king's rising, a ranked sequence of nobles admitted in stages to witness Louis waking, accepting his shirt, his coat, his wig. Each stage of admission was a signal. To be among the first permitted into the bedchamber was an honor of the highest order. To be kept waiting in the antechamber was also information, coded, precise, unmistakable. The ritual reversed each evening. The kucher, the king retires. Again the ranked procession of admission. Again the meaning encoded in proximity and exclusion. Between the lever and the kucher, meals, masses, hunts, councils, audiences, performances, all conducted according to their own exacting protocols. Who walked beside the king? Who held which candle? Who spoke first? Who bowed at precisely which angle? A glance from Louis, rare, measured, deliberate, could alter the fortune of an entire family. Courtiers who mastered this language thrived. Those who refused to learn it found themselves quietly moved to the margins. Versailles rewarded performance. It rewarded vigilance. It rewarded the suppression of every genuine impulse in favor of the perfectly sustained display. And at the center of it all, utterly composed, utterly controlled, stood Louis. He moved through rooms designed to display him with the trained grace of a lifelong dancer. He wore his elaborate wigs and heavily embroidered coats with an ease that appeared entirely natural. His public face revealed almost nothing. It suggested everything. It was a masterwork of perpetual and unbroken performance. He understood that culture was power extended into the realm of imagination. The nation that produced the most beautiful things would be admired. And admiration, sustained long enough, becomes its own political reality. So he became the most lavish and systematic patron of the arts France had ever seen. He supported Charles Le Brun, who covered the Hall of Mirrors with allegorical scenes of French glory. He supported and protected Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, known as Molière, commissioning new works for the court, shielding him from clerical critics who found his comedies intolerable. When Molière died in 1673, collapsing on stage during a performance, coughing blood into his costume, Louis arranged quietly for a proper Catholic burial, overriding church objections with a word spoken in the right direction. Even in the small administration of a playwright's death, Louis understood the long value of loyalty demonstrated. He elevated Jean-Baptiste Lully to dominance over French musical life. Lully composed operas, ballets, sacred motets, and instrumental suites with a ferocity that seems barely human in retrospect. The music of Versailles, formal, geometrically precise, emotionally controlled, was not merely entertainment. It was argument made audible, the Académie Française, the Académie Royale de Peinture et de Sculpture. Louis did not merely patronize culture. He institutionalized it, directed French artistic production toward the glorification of the crown, what historians would call the grand siècle. The great century was a genuine flowering of human creativity. It was also a meticulously managed exhibition. Both things were true. Both remain true. And here the voice stills. And the question rises, slow and heavy as incense smoke, from beneath all that gold and candlelight dot. What is the true nature of a palace where every smile is a calculated move, where a courtier learns, across long years and longer decades, to suppress every spontaneous impulse in favor of the perfectly timed performance, where a king's glance, approving, cold, or simply absent a moment too long, can determine whether a man's children inherit estates or poverty, whether a family name endures for another century or fades quietly into the general silence. Louis built Versailles from the memory of a frightened boy sleeping in cold rooms while his city rose against him. He built it to ensure that what had nearly undone him would never come close again, and he succeeded. No French nobleman would seriously threaten the crown again within his lifetime. The golden cage held, and many of its inhabitants over time came genuinely to love it. But a cage remains what it is, regardless of the quality of its gilding. We are left to wonder, in the way only the late hour permits, what grows in the shadows of that much light. What does it cost a man, even a king, to perform perfection from waking to sleeping, day after day, across a reign of 72 years? What remains of the self when the self has been surrendered entirely to the role? The mirrors of Versailles reflect everything that stands before them. Perhaps, in the end, that is precisely the difficulty. There is no corner in all that gilded blazing light where a man might simply be unobserved. There is a particular silence that falls over a nation before it goes to war, not the silence of peace, but the silence of preparation, the quiet sharpening of blades in cold armory rooms, the distant rumble of supply wagons beginning their slow, deliberate movement along roads still frozen with winter, the sound of hundreds of thousands of men being counted, uniformed, and made ready for something vast and something terrible. Louis XIV understood war the way he understood architecture, as a language of permanence, as the ultimate statement of will, made visible upon the earth itself. By the time he was 40 years of age, the court of Versailles was complete in its essential grandeur. The galleries shimmered with 10,000 candles. The gardens stretched in measured, geometric symmetry toward a horizon that France itself seemed to own. The nobility bowed and maneuvered through their gilded corridors. And Louis, standing at the center of it all, turned his gaze outward. France was wealthy. France was disciplined. France was, under the quiet supervision of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, more administratively ordered than it had ever been. But Louis did not measure greatness in balanced ledgers. He measured it in territory, in fortress walls, in the submission of foreign crowns, And so he called upon the man who would transform that ambition into iron dot. His name was Francois Michel Le Tellier, Marquis de Louvois. Before him, armies had been assembled matters, loose confederations of mercenary companies, noble cavalry units loyal more to their commanders than to any crown supply chains that were chaotic and unreliable. War was expensive, inefficient, and deeply personal in its loyalties. Louvet ended all of that. He systematized. He standardized. He reformed the officer corps from its roots, insisting that promotion would no longer be a matter of noble birth and gold, but of demonstrated competence. He created the intendants of the army, administrative officers who supervised logistics and ensured the machinery of war moved with something approaching modern precision. He introduced the uniform in a meaningful, systematic way, each regiment dressed alike, each soldier a legible part of a disciplined whole. He built, in the fullest sense, a permanent standing army, not assembled in crisis and dismissed in peace, but a professional institution maintained year-round, trained year-round, loyal to the crown and to no one else. At its height, the French army under Louis XIV numbered close to 400,000 men, the largest standing military force Europe had ever seen, the most feared, the most organized, and at the technical heart of its operations stood a quiet engineer of extraordinary gifts. His name was Sebastien Leprestre de Vauban. Vauban was not a man of courts or ceremony. He was a man who looked at the land itself and saw in it a language. He understood that a fortress was not merely a wall. It was a mathematical argument. The old medieval fortifications, with their high vertical walls, had been rendered obsolete by gunpowder artillery. A high wall, once the symbol of impregnability, was now simply a large and convenient target. Vauban's genius was to go low and to go complex. He developed the Star Fort, a system of precisely angled bastions, and sunken earthworks designed so that no attacker could advance upon any wall without being caught in the crossfire of at least two other defensive positions. The angles were calculated with the precision of a geometer. The ditches, the covered ways, the sloping glacis were engineered to deflect artillery rather than simply receive its impact. He built or rebuilt more than 160 fortifications across France's expanding borders, each one a masterwork of geometric military philosophy made permanent in stone and earth. He conducted more than 50 formal sieges in his career, and lost almost none of them. With Louveau organizing the force and Vauban directing its application. Louis XIV possessed something unprecedented, a war machine of nearly irresistible sophistication, and he used it. The first great expression came with the War of Devolution, beginning in 1667. Louis advanced a complex legal claim to certain territories in the Spanish Netherlands, the region we now call Belgium, based upon the principle of devolution. An obscure local inheritance law he chose to interpret in France's favor. The campaign was swift, almost breathtaking in its controlled efficiency. French armies swept through Flanders with a speed that alarmed the Dutch Republic, England, and Sweden, who formed a triple alliance specifically to bring the campaign to a halt. Louis accepted peace at Aix-la-Chapelle in 1668. He had acquired Lille and several other significant Flemish towns. He had demonstrated the reach and velocity of the reformed French military. and he had absorbed something quiet and burning, an awareness that it was the Dutch, the Protestant merchants of the United Provinces, who had organized a coalition against him. He did not forget this. The Franco-Dutch War began in 1672, prosecuted with a ferocity that went beyond the merely political. Louis despised the Dutch with a completeness that was almost theological. He despised their republican government, their Protestant faith, their mercantile arrogance, and the pamphlets they published mocking his dynastic claims. He crossed the Rhine with an army of 120,000 men. The Dutch, utterly unprepared, collapsed before him, but the Dutch opened their dikes. They flooded their own countryside, their own farms, their own centuries of careful reclamation from the sea. They fought with the cold desperation of a people who understood that surrender meant obliteration. The war expanded. Brandenburg, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and other powers entered against France. What had begun as a punitive expedition became a grinding, costly, continent-wide struggle lasting 6 long years. Louis nonetheless emerged from the Peace of Nijmegen in 1678 in a position of extraordinary strength. France gained the Franche-Comté and additional Flemish cities. It was by any measured accounting the high-water mark of his military achievement. Europe looked at France and trembled, and then he turned inward. The Edict of Nantes had been signed by his grandfather, Henry IV, in 1598, a pragmatic settlement of an exhausting religious civil war, granting France's Protestant Huguenots legal and religious tolerance. They could worship in designated places. They were woven into the fabric of French commerce and craft, skilled in silk weaving, in watchmaking, in printing, and military engineering. Louis despised what the edict represented. To him, it was a monument to weakness, a formal acknowledgment that a French king had once been forced to negotiate with those who rejected the true faith. For years he had eroded its provisions, restricting Protestant worship, closing their schools, dismantling the legal scaffolding that protected them. In 1685, he finished what those years of erosion had begun. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes was signed at Fontainebleau. Protestant worship was now illegal on French soil. Protestant churches were to be destroyed. Protestant pastors were to leave the country. Protestant children were to be baptized Catholic. And the dragonnades, the brutal policy of quartering soldiers in Protestant households, enforcing conversion through fear, through pillage, through deliberate violence, swept through communities that had lived in cautious peace for generations. Approximately 200,000 Huguenots fled. They carried their skills and their capital to England, to the Dutch Republic, to Prussia, to the wider colonial world. They settled and prospered, enriching the nations that received them. France lost them entirely. Louis believed it was a triumph of faith. But across Protestant Europe, the revocation hardened political opposition into something colder and more permanent, a conviction that France could not be reasoned with, negotiated with, or trusted. The coalitions that would bleed France in the coming decades were cemented, in part, by this single act of absolute religious certainty. Now, let your breathing slow. Think of a man who has built everything he ever imagined, who has organized the most powerful army in the world, who has fortified every border with mathematical precision, who has seized territories no French king before him dared to claim, and reduced an entire nation of his own people, through forced conversion, through exile, through deliberate terror, to a single prescribed faith. Think of what it costs to believe that all of this was not only necessary, but righteous. How many lives must be sacrificed on the altar of glory before a king realizes that the map of his conquests is drawn entirely in blood? Louis did not ask this question. Perhaps no man who stands at the true zenith of absolute power ever does. The sacrifices seem, in that high and golden light, like the natural cost of greatness. The exiled Huguenots, the dead soldiers in Flemish fields, the Dutch farmers who drowned their own land rather than surrender it. These are the margins of the map, and a king reading a map reads only what he chose to draw upon it. But the map remembers everything. Every border is a wound formalized in treaty. Every fortress is a wound made permanent in stone. Every exile carries within them the precise shape of what they were forced to leave behind, and the sun at its zenith casts the shortest shadow. But the day is already half over, and somewhere far below the golden light of Versailles, the long descent has quietly, irrevocably begun. The sun does not set all at once. It descends slowly, almost imperceptibly, the light shifting from brilliant gold to a deeper, more ambiguous amber. And so it was with Louis XIV in the final quarter of his long reign. The man who had stood at the zenith of European power, whose armies had made the continent tremble. That man did not fall in a single dramatic moment. He descended year by year, loss by loss, into a twilight so heavy with accumulated sorrow that even the stones of Versailles seemed, at last, to feel it by the closing years of the 17th century. The coalitions of Europe had gathered against France with a patience that no single battlefield victory could dissolve. The 9 Years' War had ground France down, and the Peace of Ryswick in 1697 forced Louis to relinquish territories and acknowledge that France could, at last, be made to yield. And then came the question that would consume the final decade of his active reign, the succession to the throne of Spain. When King Charles II, the last Spanish Habsburg, died in 1700 without an heir, he bequeathed the entirety of the Spanish Empire, its peninsular territories, its American dominions, the Spanish Netherlands, to Louis's grandson Philip, Duke of Anjou. Louis accepted it, and in doing so, lit a fuse across the entire continent. The War of the Spanish Succession began in 1701 and would not end until 1713 and 1714. It was the longest and most catastrophic war of Louis's reign. The Grand Alliance, England under Marlborough, the Holy Roman Empire under Prince Eugene of Savoy, the Dutch Republic, prosecuted this war with a ferocity France had not faced in a generation. At Blenheim in 1704, the French suffered a catastrophic and unprecedented defeat, 10,000 dead and 14,000 captured in a single afternoon. At Ramillies and Oudenarde, the French lines collapsed entirely. The treasury Colbert had so painstakingly assembled was now shattered. France borrowed against its future and taxed its nobility for the first time in memory. The star fortresses Vauban had engineered along the northern frontier fell one by one to the advancing alliance. The winter of 1709 was the coldest Europe had endured in living memory. Rivers froze solid. harvests failed. In the villages of France, ordinary men and women, those who had built Versailles stone by stone, who had sent their sons to march beneath the banners of the Sun King, were dying of cold and hunger. Lucy, aged 70, received the reports at his gilded desk with a composure those around him found difficult to read. He issued a remarkable public appeal, asking his people to endure a little longer, a gesture so unlike the divine certitude of the younger Louis that even those who had served him for 30 years felt the ground shift. A man asking rather than commanding that the treaties of Utrecht and Rastet finally closed the war. Philip retained the Spanish throne as Philip V, but he surrendered forever any claim to France itself. The great dynastic ambition, a single Bourbon, hand resting simultaneously on the crowns of France and Spain, was foreclosed permanently. France emerged with its borders largely intact, but its treasury hollow, its army exhausted, and its king visibly, irreversibly aged. The wars had cost France its treasure. The years that followed cost Louis something far more intimate and far more irreplaceable. Between the spring of 1711 and the early weeks of 1712, in the span of a single year that moved with the terrible swiftness of a nightmare, the dynastic succession Louis had spent his entire reign constructing was destroyed almost entirely. In April of 1711, his son, the Grand Dauphin, died of smallpox at 49. Louis, at 72, had outlived his heir. Then, in February of 1712, his grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, widely admired at court for his genuine intellectual seriousness, died of measles. The Duchess of Burgundy died only days before him. The warmth she had brought to the final years of Versailles extinguished just as suddenly, and within weeks of his parents, their eldest son died as well. 3 generations of direct heirs. 1 year. Gone. A second great-grandson, barely 2 years old, survived only because his governess refused to allow the royal physicians to continue bleeding the already weakened child. That small survivor would one day reign over France as Louis XV. But in those terrible weeks of 1712, Louis XIV walked the long, candlelit corridors of Versailles as a man surrounded by the ghosts of a dynasty. The ceremonies continued, the morning lever, the processional bowing, the choreography of sovereignty maintained without interruption, because they had always continued, and because to stop them would have been to admit what the logic of Versailles could not afford to admit, that a king grieves like a man. Louis did not admit it publicly, but those who attended him in the quieter hours saw something new in his eyes, something that had not been there before. The fire was lower. The distance between the king and whatever lay beyond the ceremony was narrower, and growing narrower still. The woman who steadied him through those years was Françoise d'Holbein, the Marquise de Maintenon, his secret wife, privately married sometime around 1683, never publicly acknowledged, never crowned. She had come from almost nothing, raised in poverty, widowed young, governess to the children of Louis's earlier mistress, Madame de Montespan, and risen through patience and an absolute refusal to perform anything less than complete sincerity to the most trusted companion of his private life. She was deeply practically pious, not the ornamental religion of the court, but something quieter and more demanding. Under her deepening influence, the extravagant entertainments of the younger decades gave way to evenings of prayer and scripture and measured, honest conversation. She established at St. Cyr a school for the daughters of impoverished noble families, a genuine act of charity that would outlast them both by more than a century. In her small, simply furnished apartment at Versailles, rooms strikingly plain by any measure of that palace, lit by ordinary candlelight. Without excess, Louis would sit with her in the evenings, close to the fire, and set down for a few quiet hours the infinite performance of the Sun King. No protocol, no choreography, just an old man worn through at last, and the woman who had known him longest, and most honestly. By the summer of 1715, Louis was 76 years old. The gangrene advancing through his left leg moved with a dark, patient inevitability that his physicians could observe but not halt. He bore it with the stoic composure he had brought to every public moment of a reign now longer than any in recorded history. He continued to hold audiences from his bed. He signed correspondence. He ate still in the ceremonial fashion in full view of the court, the ritual of the royal table maintained, even as his body failed him. Even in dying, the performance continued because Louis had never understood and could not now begin to understand where the performance ended and the man began. They were the same thing. They had always been the same thing. On the 1st of September, 1715, 4 days before his 77th birthday, Louis XIV died at Versailles. His reign had lasted 72 years and 110 days, the longest documented reign of any monarch in recorded European history. Among his final words, spoken quietly to those gathered at his bedside, was a simple instruction: "Do not weep for me. I die content." His body was carried through the streets of Paris to St. Denis. Along those roads, among those who had worked the frozen fields of 1709, who had sent sons to Flanders and never seen them return, there was grief, yes. But contemporary accounts note something else threading through the crowd as the procession passed, the long exhale of a people finally released from the grip of one extraordinary, all-consuming will. When the Sun King finally sets, and the gold of Versailles dims in the evening air, what remains? A palace still standing, a language that spread across the courts of Europe and never entirely receded, an idea of French cultural supremacy manufactured as deliberately as Colbert managed the treasury, and alongside it, the memory of 200,000 Huguenots driven from their homes, of villages frozen and starving in 1709, of 3 generations of heirs gone in a single year. The administrative state Louis built outlasted him by 7 decades, until the Revolution unmade what absolutism had made, and yet the architecture endures. The music plays. The plays are still performed. The ambition has left its shape pressed permanently into the clay of history. Perhaps the truest thing that can be said of Louis XIV is simply this: he was precisely what he set out to be. He chose the light, enforced it, and made the entire world agree. That is, depending on how you choose to hold it, either the most magnificent achievement any human being has ever imposed upon the world, or the most elegant and most devastating warning it has ever produced. There is no clean verdict, only the weight of it, only the silence of Versailles when the candles are gone and the mirrors reflect nothing but the dark dot. Rest now. Let the long reign end. Let the king sleep. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories, sleep dream are released here every day.